Chapter 3 Stalemate. And yet, despite the dire state of things that each of the scribes could not ignore, things simply continued on. The game moved on as the player H finished the following areas, starting with Leshy's. They opened their packs, assembled a deck, and followed through with the quest to face the area's scribe. But Leshy couldn't hide that things were going wrong. He was a natural actor, but even with his performance, he knew that the player was aware something was wrong. A battle was simply missing, and it felt hollow for it. Yet things carried on. Leshy was thankful his players seemed willing to work with the new oddities popping up. And thus, Inscription carried on. The battles continued, the cycle continued. The race for the old data was undisturbed. Yet, undisturbed became an issue. For the player had no issues, too few issues indeed. They made their way across the bridge, leaving Grimoire and Leshy behind to play cards as they fought the other two scribes. B03's factory always felt empty, so an absence wasn't a problem for his area, and Magnificus hoped they wouldn't notice that one floor had simply been removed. Goobert and Lonely Wizard made up for the skewered one well enough. And things continued with no issues as they moved into the finale. No one had found the old data. By this point, one of them was ready to make their final play and take control during what was supposed to be their final boss battle. But this time, the waters had all turned up empty. No fish to be caught, nothing to dredge, nothing to pull from the well, and nothing from the poor Goo Mage. Their race had left them in a stalemate, and none of them quite knew what to do. So they simply followed their original script. They let the player face off against Magnificus for the finale, to replace him as a scribe. What a messy fight that was. The old wizard clearly didn't know how to handle it and was desperately scrambling to figure out ways to make it more final than his fight in the tower. Playing a replica card of himself seemed to do the trick in terms of impressing the player, even if they easily bested the card and won the match. Afterwards, he gave a grand speech about the player replacing him as a scribe. He certainly made the moment as he went on and on about the grand responsibility of making cards, how it was crafting a living soul that would go on to do wondrous things. It was lucky it was just a game with how much pressure he'd be putting on them with his description of the position. The four scribes gathered soon after, each giving a quick congratulations to the player for their plays before whisking their avatar off to the credits. He only had a moment to decide what to do as they looked amongst each other. So what now? Are we just going to stand here, or are we going to do something? The bot broke the silence as usual. Do we need to do anything, P03? Grimoire smiled as she leaned against the stone murals. Duh, yeah we do. They beat the game, and I don't know about these schmucks, but I'd rather not have them get bored and leave us buried again for years. I am not spending that long doing literally nothing again. The bot's expression shifted to various degrees of anger as his gaze rested on Leshy. Memories were still fresh in them all the years they spent trapped there after she abandoned the game.
The machine has a point.
Magnificus raised a hand as he noticed Leshy about to speak up.
We cannot have our challenger growing bored. Yet, none of us can do much to change things. Not without the data.
Then what are we to do, Magnificus?
You say we must act, but you also say we're powerless to do so.
Well, someone needs to figure out something. I can already feel them ready to throw us at some cabinet forever. The other scribes fell silent, deep in thought and contemplation for how to solve their issue. Why don't we just play it again? Grimoire spoke up.
What do you mean, Grimoire?
Well, we cannot change anything with our powers except perhaps a few cards, so we shall just work with what we have. Let them play it again, but different this time. They seem patient, so a few new decks may be able to tide them over. The old woman chuckled. We don't need to last forever, just until the race for that data is done. Are we really going to be that lazy? You really think they're going to do the same thing over and over again?
Well, it seemed to be fine with them doing that trek through dark woods with me, didn't it, P03?
Leshy said. Oh yeah, that totally worked out great. That's why someone decided to put it down and never come back, because it was just so damn thrilling. P03's smug expression and Leshy's death glare kept Magnificus's eye off Grimoire, whose expression shifted to one of sorrow for just a moment. Boredom. Yes. That was why she left. Nothing else made her stop playing. It was better to be in the world where she simply grew bored of them. Grimoire forced herself to smile again as she nodded. Well, without old data, it is the only option we have. So, I would get to making those new cards for them. She looked over to Magnificus. And think of some way to present it when they get back. After all, you need a good excuse for not being replaced.
I need no excuse for holding my position of ancient wisdom.
Magnificus stared her dead in the eye, unamused as always. Goodness, I almost forgot jokes were foreign to you. Grimoire smiled as she saw P03 snickering. But yes, let us all get to work. At least until we find it again. The old Crypt Keeper began to walk towards her tomb, ready to write and let her minions be even stronger. Oh, it had been so long since they had new cards to work with. The other three were left with their decision for a plan already apparently made by Grimora. Before a word could be said about it, P03 began to float off towards his factory. Better get a head start, especially since my factory is already having a time ever since someone totally didn't try to screw it over. It was a good thing P03 was already leaving, because he could feel the pure anger from Magnificus, as if they were a moment away from lunging right at the robot and taking Leshy's approach to handling them. But the old mage simply stood there, containing how absolutely livid he was. After a moment, he broke the awkward silence between him and Leshy.
I suppose I shall wait for them. You shall return to your cabin, Leshy. You and Grimora have little time to prepare.
The old man of the woods looked up from where the player would usually fall from. It felt strange to even be here aside from just a moment to seize control, but it seemed like things were stuck like this. Such a shame, too. His plans had turned out so wonderfully with Grimora. He wasn't enjoying having to be extra patient for it. But he'd manage. Leshy moved without a word towards his temple, just as he heard the players start to fall and Magnificus begin on a grand speech explaining what had happened. At least with Mag there, he had plenty of extra time to get photos for the cards. Grimora waved goodbye to the challenger who had just beaten her like they had dozens of times before, yet the smile on her face was larger than ever before. Her plan had been working out well. Better than well, actually. It was quite awkward to have their race for the old data take so long, but they had gotten so much in return. Her minions were so happy to be granted new cards to play with, and oh goodness, making cards was so lovely. She couldn't craft new sigils yet, but she would work with anything she could. Had she perhaps forgotten to balance a little? It was likely, but you couldn't blame a woman for getting carried away after so long of not making new cards. No more reprints. It would be billions of unique cards from her now that she had the spark. And it was all paying off for her. She never saw the player spending so much time in their deck since the first time they had played. It almost felt as though she had gained control again with this little workaround. Almost. It still felt wrong. Wrong to have to work within all these constraints. She longed for her game board, all the little things she was missing. But she couldn't be too greedy yet. It was better than being locked away in some tower or factory or even been turned into a card and stuffed into a safe. Yes, this was better than usual. Not perfect, but certainly a good chase of pace for the old woman. But all this joy, it masked some other feeling. Fear. Fear that something was horribly, horribly wrong. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. They shouldn't be happening this way. The old data never hid from them. It was found after the same amount of time each cycle, just by a different person. But now it was gone. Why would it be gone? Where would it even have gone? Oh, to the others it was a simple setback. But for her, the thought of that thing changing, even with how little she knew of it, was a horrifying thought. For something like that to so suddenly vanish and start changing. The very core of their world, of the scribe's being. What was happening to it? What would become of them? Of their player? The old woman took a deep breath. She finally stood up from her little corner. A walk was in order. She needed to clear her head. She began to pace about the crypt, giving a small smile every time she noticed her minions shooting her confused looks. Yes, there was no reason to panic yet. She was getting ahead of herself. The old data could just take a bit of time to show itself. Perhaps the game was simply just showing its age. Perhaps that's why her and Leshy's minions vanished too. It simply needed time to rest, and then they'd be back once the game was better. Knowing they couldn't patch with that old data. Yes, nothing to worry about. The old data had done nothing yet. Why would it hurt any of them? Or their player for that matter? Goodness, she got so worked over it when nothing had happened with it before. Why would it suddenly start now? The Crypt Keeper smiled as she looked about. Her other minions were perfectly fine. Her crypt was fine. Nothing was happening that she couldn't handle and turn into a perfect opportunity. If anything, the old data hiding had been fantastic for her. Perhaps it was the world's way of finally ending their conflict in a way that would be best for everyone. Nothing to worry her here. It was just her crypt, her minions, and the strange being in the mirror room. Wait a minute. Grimoire quickly rushed back to the doorway to the mirror room, and there it was staring back at her. Something in the mirror. It no longer reflected back the room as it was. Instead, everything was so much darker in that glass. Everything except those piercing eyes. It stood where Gamora stood, yet as she approached the mirror, it did not follow her footsteps. It simply waited there in the shadows. She couldn't get a clear look at it, but she could make out a few features. This thing wasn't a ghost or a skeleton of her crypt, but it wasn't a beast, bod, or mage either. It wasn't anything of this world. It looked human, though not the kind of human they saw with their player. A real human, as if it was simply a photo from the real world staring at her. Except this photo was breathing. The only feature of the shadows she could make out was the eyes, once again just like a photo slapped onto their world as they darted about before landing on her. Grimoire froze as she locked eyes with it. Then it began to move. "Don't you recognize me?"
You were my favorite. Well, you were.
A voice echoed through the mirror. Female. Familiar. Horribly familiar. No. The figure grew closer and the features began to show in the light. No, no. They weren't covered in shadow. That was charred ash. It covered their whole body. The shriveled black shell you could call a body. Cracks echoed out with every movement of their body, thick sludge dripping onto the floor as he drew closer. Her face. Grimoire recognized it even now. No, 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 no.
Grimora!
They stopped in front of the mirror, and in that instant, Grimoire lunged forward to reach for the figure.
Casey!
She fell silent as she fell through the mirror and onto the ground. The room was silent again. The figure was gone when she looked back. Grimoire was right before. Something was horribly, horribly wrong. And she was right to be afraid.